The poem we'll be revising in today's video is Kamikaze. Like Poppies, Kamikaze offers us a new perspective into war, also from someone left behind, but it has a very different tone. And through the poem, Beatrice Garland captures the profound psychological toll of war and duty. The poem explores the theme of conflict on multiple levels, not just the external conflict of war, but also the internal moral and emotional conflict faced by individuals when they are forced to choose between their personal values and societal expectations. This video will provide a detailed analysis of the poem. As usual, we will read the poem, we'll discuss its overview, we will annotate it in detail, discussing both language and form, and finally we'll think about which other poems in the Power and Conflict anthology you could compare it to. By the end of this session, you will have a comprehensive understanding of this poem, allowing you to approach your exam with confidence and clarity. Let's read the poem first. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other, in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers waiting on the shore built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chatted and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So, what's going on in this poem? What's the plot? It's a narrative poem that presents the experience of a kamikaze pilot during World War II. And the pilot, having been assigned a suicide mission, because that's what kamikaze pilots did, they gave their lives for their country and it was their duty. So the pilot, having been assigned this suicide mission, turns back at the last moment. Because when he is lying there, he looks down, he sees the sea beneath him, and it brings up all of these memories. And that causes him to turn around. But when he returns home, he is completely rejected by his family. It is as though he has symbolically died, even though he hasn't physically died, because he didn't complete his duty. And in his family's eyes, he dishonored them. The poem is conveyed through the voice of his daughter. There's that mention of her addressing her children, so she's recounting this tale. And she reflects on the shame and emotional trauma that follows his decision and the repercussions that had for her family. Themes such as duty, shame, honour, family, and the psychological impact of war are central to the poem. Let's think a bit about the context. Context is crucial for the understanding of the poem because it refers to these kamikaze pilots. So kamikaze pilots were Japanese pilots in World War II who were expected to sacrifice their lives by crashing their planes into enemy targets. It was often seen as the ultimate act of patriotism in Japan. However, this poem presents a deviation from that expectation, focusing on the internal conflict of a pilot who, in the final moments, decides not to carry out this mission. This historical backdrop is therefore essential because it highlights the immense pressure on individuals to conform to nationalistic ideals and the personal consequences of rejecting these ideals. There's that really haunting final line, which would be the better way to die? That either he has to sacrifice his life literally and physically in the name of his country, or his family treat him as though he had died. He does die in a way to them because he has dishonored them. Let's annotate the poem. So this opening line, her father embarked at sunrise. The reason I've highlighted her father, this is what we call a third person possessive pronoun, her. And the reason this is significant is because of the contrast to the later pronoun when she says, my mother. So in the beginning, it's not clear to us that actually the speaker of the poem is the man's daughter. So you've got the contrast to the my mother that comes later. And even though we're not aware of it, it's setting up that initial detachment or estrangement that she has from her father as a consequence of him not completing his mission. And we have embarked at sunrise. Sunrise is a symbol in Japan of new beginnings. And although it's a symbol of new beginnings, he believes he's going to his death. And as we know, he won't actually physically die, but he will die in a figurative way to his family. There's quite a lot of symbolism in this first stanza because you have the sunrise and the symbol of that, and then a samurai sword, which is a very powerful symbol of Japanese tradition. And it signifies or signals that pride that warriors take. And there's a lot of honor and duty when it comes to samurai. And it's that tradition, that Japanese warrior tradition of duty and honor that this poem is drawing from. And he's described as having a shaven head and being full of powerful incantations. An incantation is a chant. This phrase, full of powerful incantations, chants or invocations, it's insinuating that he is brainwashed or indoctrinated in some way. That this is a very oppressive form of patriotism. It's a patriotism that expects them to take their own life. In a way, it's jingoism, which is a very extreme form of patriotism because it's expecting them to give their life for their country. And as we'll see with this next line, a one-way journey into history, that is signalling the expected self-sacrifice of the soldiers, that they are meant to sacrifice their lives for their country. It's a wonderful line, isn't it? A one-way journey into history. It highlights the finality of the kamikaze pilot's duty, what's expected of them, to become a part of history, to cease to be, and to cut off any future for themselves, and to be relegated only to the past with their sacrifice, to become a part of history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children. Garland is good at revealing this throughout the poem. We don't know where this narrative is coming from, and it gradually is revealed that actually it's coming from the pilot's daughter herself. But this idea, recounting it later to her children, it's preparing us for that switch to the first person later, when she says my mother, and linking to that first line, her father embarked, that initial detachment or estrangement from her father. But it's also showing that this shame that we're going to see later in the poem, the shame at not completing his mission, is passed down the generations. So halfway on his mission to sacrifice himself for his country, he looks down and he sees these little fishing boats below him, strung out like bunting. That's an interesting noun to use because it connotes celebration, which seems incongruous with the bleakness of his journey. And then you have this green-blue translucent sea. If something's translucent, it lets the light shine through. And it's a very beautiful image, full of tranquility, and that obviously is a harsh contrast to the war. And this beautiful image beneath the pilot continues, arcing and swathed like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other. I find it interesting that the fish's movement is likened to a huge flag. Why? What do we connect flags with? We connect flags to countries and to patriotism. So there's definitely a link to patriotism there. Here, the patriotism is not for the country, and it's not connected to his country. So here, instead, it's the natural world saluting the pilot, and perhaps even surpassing the construct, what mankind have created, this idea of human patriotism to one's country, that so the natural world is surpassing that. And it describes their movement as a figure of 8. If I draw that, what is that the symbol for, do you know? It's the symbol of infinity. Is that communicating the everlasting, eternal essence of nature when compared to the transience? And transience means how fleeting something is, of human conflict. That on one side, this signal of the infinity is showing that it is nature and the natural world that is everlasting and eternal, whereas human conflict, by comparison, is somewhat insignificant because it doesn't last. It's not eternal in the same way that nature is. That could be one interpretation. Dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swivel towards the sun. There's a lot of sibilance in these lines. Well, sibilance and sibilant sounds. Remember, sibilance is the alliteration of the letter S, and sibilant sounds are those sh sounds. As I say again and again, it's not enough to just spot these methods and to say, oh, this is a simile, this is a metaphor. You have to always address the effect of the method. And in this then, sibilance, it's funny because sibilance often creates a hissing, and that hissing can often be quite sinister. We often connect sibilance to darker things. Think about the sibilance, for example, in Exposure, of the bullets hissing through the air. Here, though, I'd say actually the sibilance, it captures the swishing of the water. For me, anyway, it captures the onomatopoeic sound of the water, shh, like the waves crashing. So the sibilant sounds, that it captures the motion of the fish through water, potentially. And that makes that natural world seem more captivating. If you think, it's the natural world that really is calling this kamikaze pilot away from his mission. And so there's something about it that must be captivating him, that must be entrancing him. And for me, that idea of the infinity, the figure of eight, the flag, the fact that the fish, that they're described as a flag waving to him, their infinite power is conveyed, and then that sibilant sound, it's all to make the natural world more captivating. And in this stanza, we see the effect that the natural world is having on him. And the natural world then is eliciting, it's drawing out memories from him, evoking memories. And throughout this image of his brothers playing, building cairns or building stacks of pebbles, and to see whose stack of pebbles can withstand the waves breaking in as they wait for their father to come back from fishing. It has a sort of golden nostalgia, rather it creates a nostalgic tone. And it is reminding him, therefore, it's reminding the pilot what it means to be alive, what it means to grow up. Perhaps even he's thinking about his own children, as we know he does have children. And that aside, that yes, grandfather's boat, it's revealing more and more about the speaker. So that aside, it's revealing the speaker's personal connection to this pilot, and therefore raises questions about that initial attachment of her father. Because now she's saying, yes, grandfather's boat. So this man's father was her grandfather. And as we'll see later, my mother, she no longer sees him as her father. And then it's talking about his grandfather coming in and lists all the fish, describing the tuna as the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. A prince is deserving of respect. So all of that, especially the description of the tuna, it hints at the superiority of nature. And we move to these final two stanzas, which are somewhat devastating. And though he came back, so we know that he didn't actually die. We know that he didn't follow through with this mission, this one-way journey into history. He returned instead. But my mother never spoke to him again. You have that real contrast with her father at the beginning. And these are called personal pronouns. So you have the real contrast, my mother, her father at the beginning. And what that's showing, and it's the same here, yes, grandfather's boat, he is no longer her father in a way. And that's consolidated through the rest of the poem. My mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. He was treated as though he no longer existed. This is the price that he must pay for not conforming to the expectations of the society in which he lives. They are expected to be so patriotic as to sacrifice their lives for their country. And when they don't do that, they are considered cowardly and a source of utter shame. And we're seeing that shame. So this is the consequence of betraying the ideals of his country. And it's showing the severity of that betrayal. And therefore, what a source of inner conflict for him. If he knew when he was making this journey, this pilot, if he knew what would happen if he turned back, he knew that he would be shunned, because that is what's happening. If he knew he was going to be shunned by society, but he made that decision anyway, that's showing what a conflict it was. Till gradually we too learned to be silent. Just as it mentions her telling her children in the second stanza, we see again that this idea of shame, it's passed down the generations. Of course, when they're children and they chatted and laughed, When you're a child, you are innocent and naive and blissfully unaware of these sorts of issues. But as they grow up, they too learn to conform to how people think they should behave in society. And they then conform to blanking their own father and not acknowledging their own father. And this final bit is so sad. This was no longer the father we loved. And again, the father. Never in the poem is he described as my father. We have my mother, and we have her saying, oh, grandfather, without a pronoun, but it's her father or the father. It's never my father. And so, even with the personal pronouns, Garland is showing that loss of her father. This was no longer the father we loved. Because he didn't do what was expected of him, he lost his identity. So, because he didn't conform to what society had expected of him, because he didn't, and he acted dishonourably as they saw it, and he didn't carry out his duty, he has lost the right to be called their father. He's lost his family, lost the right to be respected or even acknowledged by his family. And as it says, this really haunting final line, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. And that shows the gravity of his decision. Because either he has to physically die, which obviously is something that many people are fearful of, or he has to suffer a symbolic death and never be acknowledged again by his family. So either one or the other. He either has to sacrifice his life or sacrifice the place within his family. And with that, it's adding so many more layers to this experience of conflict that we've seen before. So at the heart of this poem, you have the inner conflict of the pilot, as well as the external conflict of the war that he is a part of. Let's talk a moment about the structure. The structure of this poem is what we call free verse, like many of the poems in this collection, which means that it doesn't have a consistent rhyming pattern or meter. However, it does have quite strict 6-line stanzas. So on one hand, you have the free verse, but on the other hand, you have these tightly controlled 6-line stanzas. And actually, that in a way then mirrors the conflict of the pilot himself, because you have the free-flowing form of the free verse without any constraints of meter or rhyme. But on the other side, you have the conformity of the rigid 6-line stanzas. And perhaps one interpretation could be, therefore, the structure reflects the conflict of the pilot. Let's think about which poems you could potentially compare it to. You could compare it to Charge of the Light Brigade, because both present the experience of soldiers in war. Tennyson's poem, however, largely celebrates the bravery of these soldiers, whereas Kamikaze presents a more complex view, focusing on the emotional and psychological consequences of military duty and service. And another obvious comparison would be to Poppies, because both demonstrate the effect of war on the families left at home. Poppies, however, focuses on a mother's overwhelming grief after the loss of her son, and it's implied that the son's death is a physical, literal one. Kamikaze, on the other hand, highlights the internal conflict of the individual soldier and the social rejection he faces after his decision. His death with his family is more of a symbolic one rather than a literal one. I hope this was useful and that it helped deepen your understanding of the poem for your revision. In conclusion, Garland's poem Kamikaze is a poignant reflection on the emotional and moral complexities of war. The poem explores the tension between national duty and personal morality, while also addressing the social and familial consequences of a soldier's actions. By understanding these elements, you'll be well equipped to approach the poem in your exam and offer insightful analysis. Remember to consider both the individual's internal conflict, as well as the societal expectations placed upon them in this poem. Like the others, it is another haunting depiction of war, with that really poignant final line. And we are left wondering, like the soldier, which would have been the better way to die? To have gone and died and fulfilled his duty according to his country, or in his decision not to sacrifice himself for his country, to have lost his family in the process. It's a very heavy decision, and again reflects the complex and brutal truth of war.